You guys ready? Cool. All right, here we go. So there's this parable that Jesus told that is it's really famous parable. It's one that I think we're familiar with, but it's also one that is seemingly unpleasant. And so because it's sort of unpleasant, it's not like at the top of our list for like stuff we want to talk about because again, most of us as people of faith want to talk about pleasant things. And so this story doesn't really do that. But in this story, it's about a man, it's about two men actually, one of whom does not have a name in the story. He's just called the rich man. And then there's another one that's named Lazarus. The rich man, that's his name, and that's also his description in the story. He is wealthy in every possible way. He has money, he has land, he wears fancy clothes, he is he has all the kind of the markers for being at the top of society. He's respected, he's honored. He has all the things that being wealthy brings you. And on the outside looking in, from everybody's perspective, everybody who knows him, he is someone that you can look up to, that you should honor, and that you should, want to be like. Somebody that you could rightly say is blessed by God. That's one man in this story. The other man in the story is named Lazarus. Should not be confused with the other Lazarus that we've talked about recently. The guy gets raised from the dead. That guy was real. This guy is not. He's just a guy in his story. Apparently, Lazarus is like Hank. It's just a really common name. I don't know. It's weird. I always bring up Hank as if Hank is common. I don't think it is. But in my head, every dude is named Hank. Anyway, it's a common name like John or Aiden or Connor. I don't know, whatever. Lazarus is the Connor of the Bible. There we go. Lesson number 1 today. So there's Lazarus, and Lazarus is the exact opposite. He's the exact opposite of the rich man. He's homeless. He actually lives on the streets outside of the gates of one of the properties of the rich man. And he's homeless, and he has nothing, and he has no wealth, and he has no money, and he is just trying to survive every day. And on top of that, he is diseased. He has this horrible skin disorder. And in the story, we're told that, because he has this disorder, he has some unlikely friends, and those are street dogs, which is interesting because unlikely friends, it's not like a Disney movie. Like, in the ancient world, ancient Jewish people don't like dogs. Dogs are unclean. You don't want to be with dogs, and you certainly don't want them for the reason that Lazarus had them. Lazarus is covered in open sores, which means you can like see under his skin. You can see like blood and guts and stuff and pus and all the stuff. And the dogs would come along, and the dogs wanted to eat him because they're dogs. So what they would do is have a little taste. Like it's Thanksgiving and like you're in the kitchen and you're like, hey, what's this like? And then somebody slaps your hand like, no, not yet. Like dinner's at 5 and it's 2:30, but you're like, I got to get a little bite. That's what the dogs are doing to him by licking him all the time. Not a great life. He's the opposite. Like this guy is not going to the gram and saying #blessed. Okay, like he's not living a life that anyone would want or anybody would think was honorable or anybody would think is good. And so in this story, we have these two men. And then once we set up the two men, Jesus says, okay, they both die. In the story, in the parable, Jesus says both men die. And they leave this world the way they lived it. Lazarus has no funeral. No one notices he's gone except, of course, the hungry dogs. Nobody has any idea that he died. Nobody cares. He doesn't have a funeral. He doesn't have, nobody gives eulogies. He does nobody's weeping for him. He's just gone. But Jesus says the angels came and took him. And they took him to paradise, essentially. They took him to be with Father Abraham. And not just to be with Father Abraham, but be at the side of Father Abraham, or in some translations, the bosom of Father Abraham. But what he's saying is he's going to be with God's people in the afterlife as an equal with those who are honored. So just as Abraham would be honored, Lazarus is honored. And they sit at the table and they dine and they feast and they relax and they have all the pleasures of whatever is in the next life. And Lazarus enjoys this wonderful existence after his horrible existence on earth. On the other hand, the rich man has the exact opposite experience. It starts with having a beautiful, lavish, massive funeral. I'm talking old ladies wailing. I'm talking like sons giving eulogies that bring tears to your eyes. I'm talking a huge feast afterwards. I mean, I'm talking this the best you can have, this massive funeral because he was honored and respected and loved and cared for. But he was not taken by angels to paradise. He was sent to a place called Hades, a place where there was suffering, a place where there was fire, where there was no relief, where there was no rest. And the rich man being in Hades is not there for very long before he says, man, I don't want to be here. This isn't good. And so he looks at paradise. In this story, somehow you can see between paradise and Hades, you can see, and he looks and he sees Abraham, and he's like, I want to be with that guy. And so he calls out to Abraham, and he's like, hey, can you help me out here? And Abraham's like, look, I can't do anything. There's this huge gap between us, a great chasm between us, and I can't do anything. And he's like, well, can you at least like get me some water or something? And he's like, there's nothing I can do, dude, nothing. He's got to call him dude because we don't have a name. Like, man, I have no idea. I can't do anything. He's like, okay, well, this is awful. And the rich man thinks about things in terms of, like his suffering in Hades has made him selfless to a degree. And he says, look, I got 5 brothers, and they're all living the way that I lived. And if I'm here, they will be here too. Could you send somebody to go talk to them? Like, hey, there's that guy. I know him. He used to hang out outside of my gates. He was that homeless dude. Send him back. Send him back and have him tell my brothers. And Abraham's like, look, as it turns out, God gave you all the information you needed. He gave you Moses. He gave you the law. He gave you the prophets. You were supposed to figure this out. Like, your brothers have got that too. They are supposed to figure this out. If they're not, well, sorry for them, but God has provided for them. And the rich man then says, but look, if you would send a dead guy, if somebody would come back to life, they're not going to listen to the law and the prophets. That stuff's boring. But if you bring somebody back from the dead, surely they'll listen. I know my brothers. And Abraham's like, dude, I know your brothers too. If they won't listen to the law and the prophets and Moses, they are also not going to listen to a dead guy. The end. You can see why that's not like children's church kind of story. Like, you can see why we don't take like first graders and be like, hey, lake of fire in Hades. It's probably where you're going to go if you don't listen. You're being noisy. I mean, some churches definitely do that. You shouldn't. That's bad. That's how you traumatize children. Anyway, this story is interesting because, usually, like, if you've heard this story, you probably have heard the story. You've probably heard a couple of different lessons that come from it. I've heard a couple of different lessons from the story, a couple of different applications. Like, preachers tell the story, and they're like, hey, this is what I'm going to tell you how to apply the story. And I think most of the time, our lessons about this story are dumb. They're just wrong. I think they're just dumb is a technical theological term. They're just wrong. They're just incorrect. So like one thing we often do with the story is we take this story and we make it a template for literal afterlife. See, because the thing is, like, we have hope that, like, when we die, it's not the end. Right? And we understand that, like, in the afterlife, whatever the afterlife is, that there is reward and punishment. We read about judgment in the Bible and things like that. And we read things about, Gehenna, and, our Bibles just call everything hell, but, like, there's different words for it, and there's Gehenna and stuff. And then there's heaven and paradise. It's a whole giant conversation. And I think sometimes we're like, hey, Jesus told a parable that's like a one-stop shop. Right? If we just, like, I don't have to read the rest of the Bible. I don't have to read anything else. I can just look at this story. And so a lot of people look at this story, and we push details in this story. And we say, well, that's what it's like. Some people go to paradise, some people go to hell, and there's something between them, and nobody can cross, and nobody can do anything. Here's why that's dumb. In this story, there are very definite cultural markers that cannot be ignored that you and I would never actually include if we were to tell a similar story. For example, not a single person in this room wants to die and go hang out with Abraham. Like, maybe he's got some cool stories, but nobody in this room is like, you know what the afterlife is really all about? Old Honest Abe. He's got this table, and we eat food together. He'll tell me all about that time that he said that his wife was really his sister. I can ask about those things. He's not going to love when I bring that up. That's a bad story, Abe. I can bring up the time he tried to kill his son. That was cool. Like, none of us care about Abraham. Like, I like Abraham as much as the next guy, but nobody is like, you know what I'm looking forward to in the next life is Abraham. Because we're not Jewish people 2,000 years ago. Jewish people 2,000 years ago thought Abraham was the bee's knees. Everything, I mean, for them, going to hang out with Abraham, being honored as an equal with Abraham, that was it, because they were Jews 2,000 years ago. Equally, not a single person in this room believes in Hades. Like, okay, yeah, the dude from the Hercules movie, of course. But, like, nobody in this room is worried that one day you're going to die and somehow end up in Hades. We haven't believed in Hades as, like, Christians in something like 2,000 years. Christian teaching took Jewish teaching, tweaked it a whole bunch, looked at it and said, I don't think it's quite that. I don't think it's quite that. And I don't think it's quite that. And what we did was we eliminated the concept of Hades altogether. It's not called Hades, fire, and brimstone preaching, right? It's hellfire and brimstone. Like, even when we want to, like, be the jerks that are screaming at people about, punishment after death, we're not yelling about Hades. Like, when you read this story, it screams at you. This is a cultural story because it's a parable. That's how parables work. We're not supposed to take them literally. And so a lot of times people will do that. They'll take this and they'll say, oh, it's got to be literal. And they ignore the fact that Abraham is over here and Hades is over here. And it's not what we're doing here. That's not what Jesus was doing. That's one thing. That's kind of level one of bad preaching from the story of Rich Man and Lazarus. But there's another level that's neat. And that level gets to be about our economics. We do this a lot. A lot of our modern culture, a lot of our modern theologians boil everything down to money. And it's probably because, well, we're Americans. And so we boil everything down to money in a lot of ways. And so one of the things that happens a lot of times is this story becomes a rich people bad, poor people good story. Rich people bad, poor people good. And far be it from me to like argue with that on its face, because look, Jesus does explain very clearly that it is more difficult. The more wealth you have, the more barriers there are to you having faith in God. And so he does teach it is harder for wealthy people to participate in the kingdom because they just have more worries and more things to deal with. Like, there's just more barriers. It just is what it is. But what's interesting about this story is a lot of people take the story and say, well, see, rich people are terrible. Look at the rich man. He doesn't care about the poor man. One of my favorite details in the story is he actually asks Abraham to send the homeless dude. Like, the homeless dude has nothing better to do in the afterlife but to be sent back to earth where he hated everything. It's like being sent back to 7th grade. Like, if you are like, Drew, I'm going to give you $25 million, but you have to live 7th grade again. I'm going to ask you to quadruple that number, and I'm going to have to think on it. Okay, I did not enjoy 7th. Like, that's what he's doing. Like, go back into earth, and like, because he still clearly thinks that he's in a position where he can order this guy around. Probably because in his life he was in a position where he could order people around. And so people look at this and say, well, rich people are bad and poor people are good. And again, I understand. I get why we would do that. But it's so important that we understand this. Abraham was a rich dude. The good guy in this story, massively rich. If you think about like any of the patriarchs, like any of the Old Testament people, like they were all massively wealthy. Like, do you think King David was poor? His name was King David. And that was not his given name. He inherited that name when he became King David. These people had money. They just did. And what's interesting is the New Testament actually highlights that there are really wealthy people who do really good things for Jesus. There's also wealthy people who do bad things to Jesus. There's also poor people who do wonderful things for Jesus. There's also poor people who do terrible things to Jesus. Like, turns out what's in your bank account has little to nothing to do with what you do with Jesus. Outside, of course, of Jesus saying, like, well, if you got more distractions, you got more things, you got all that. But the reality is this story defies simple explanations. And often when we give simple explanations for stories like these, we're doing everybody a disservice. So we shouldn't do that. But I do think that we can do this with this story. There is a lesson we need to learn and something I want us to move forward in this sermon with. There is not a connection between God's blessing and God being happy with you and how well your life is going. Those two concepts are completely divorced. The rich man's life went well, as far as we can tell in the story, it's a story, his entire life. It was always good. His life was always going good. Going well. Going good is not grammatically correct. I'm so sorry to all of my English teachers, specifically my mom, who taught school and always corrected me on that. It's weird, parents, what happens, I knew it was wrong, and then I hear my mom's voice like, Drew, there's absolutely no connection between, this man's life went well, but then at the end, he finds out God was not happy with him at all. There was not a connection between him going well and God being happy. On the opposite end of the spectrum, though, you've got a man who everything went poorly. This is a man that dogs wanted to eat, okay? This is not good for this man. Homeless, diseased, hungry, alone, dies, and the funeral doesn't exist. Everything was bad, and yet God clearly was happy with him. Nothing went well, God was happy. Everything goes well, God's not happy. There is a divorce, and we have to separate those two things. We have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that when our lives are going well, God must be happy, and when our lives are going poorly, God must be unhappy. That's what this story teaches. It's not what we think. It's a lot deeper than that. It's a lot more complicated. You can't just look at your life and be like, well, I'm feeling good, so I guess things are good. Lots of people who have no relationship with God whatsoever feel awesome, okay? It needs to be said. And so many people who have a wonderful relationship with God feel terrible. As it turns out, feelings and how well things are going do not reflect our relationship with God. Which brings us to the story we were in the middle of talking about. Last week, we began talking about this very famous story where Jesus walks in water and performs these other miracles. We had a boat teleport. That was fun. I liked that. That was cool. But we were calling this sermon series The Storm because everything is revolving around a storm. This storm that was very difficult, that was very hard, that was life-threatening, that it terrified the disciples. This storm that brought into their lives moments, hours of sheer panic. And it happened after Jesus feeds 5,000 people. It happens at the end of that. And this is what we read. Last week we read John's version of this, but this is what Mark says. It's a really, really fascinating perspective from John, from Mark, the way he tells it. This is what we read in the Gospel according to Mark. It says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the winds and the waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. Couple things we need to see here. First of all, the disciples row their boat into a storm. But the disciples only row their boat into a storm because Jesus insisted on it, says our translation. The original language, the original word here is Jesus forced them. They didn't want to. Half the group is fishermen, right? Imagine you're Peter. You know how to read clouds. You know how to read when a storm is coming. He doesn't want to go on this boat and go out in the middle of the night. He wants to stay right there and wait till tomorrow because he knows what's out there. And Jesus forces them to go. Which is to say, here is this terrible situation, a life-threatening danger. And Jesus makes his disciples go straight into it. On top of that, though, I love this detail. And look, we're given like half the story here, and that's interesting, but like there's enough for us to figure it out. Jesus is in the hills, and he's praying, and he's by himself, and he's doing his stuff. And he looks out, and he can see the storm, and you imagine like it's just clear, and he sees the storm, and he sees a boat, and he's like, well, those guys are in some trouble. Now, understand the way that like ancient people work, okay? They don't have electricity. They don't have street lights. So give yourself 30 seconds to think, when might their day end? When the sun goes away, right? Like that's just, they would have been awake when the sun's out, and they would have gone to bed when the sun's not out. It's the way it works. Jesus would have ended the miracle with the 5,000 when the sun was going down, when it was getting dark. Jesus then goes into the hills, and he waits till 3 a.m. to come help the disciples. Let's be charitable. I don't know what time of year it was. Let's say this is Alaska, and the sun is out at 11 o'clock at night. Jesus watches the disciples struggle and nearly die for 4 hours. Also, this is in Alaska. 4 hours. Jesus is in the hills watching his disciples nearly die. And he just says, seems good. If you just think about this, they're like, where is Jesus? He's watching us right now. We're going to die, and he's going to watch us die. Think about, Jesus. The point is, Jesus wanted his disciples in the storm, and he wanted them to fix the storm or fix the thing or figure out the storm or survive or whatever. He wanted them to do it on their own. And of course, you might be asking, why? And of course, the first thing in your head is, I bet he's got a lesson to teach them. And he did. This is what we read in the Gospel according to Mark a little bit later. After he sees them, it says, Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage. I am here. Then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. The miracle of the loaves is the feeding of the 5,000. This is what we're seeing here. Jesus had a lesson he wanted them to learn that day. And he wanted them to learn it from something very nice. He feeds 5,000 people and some whatever, 5,000 men and some other people. And he does this amazing miracle. And he wants them to learn something from it. I don't even know what it is. We're not actually told what it is. But there's a lesson they're supposed to learn. And guess what they didn't learn? That lesson. So Jesus is all, well, they didn't learn it from a good thing. I'll show them by a bad thing. Hey, you had a chance to do this the easy way. Now let's do it the hard way. Go out into the storm. And Peter's like, I don't want to do that. And he's like, yeah, but you need to. Here's the deal. They learn. So we'll get to, I believe next week or the week after, we'll see they do learn. Well, they do learn. They do learn it. But there's something here that's fascinating. God has a funny way of teaching us stuff. And it says their hearts were too hard. That's a fascinating phrase, because the other time I hear that like their hearts are too hard, I always think of the Pharaoh in Exodus. Like the Pharaoh is like literally seeing miracles and is like, nope, don't want that. That's not good. That ended poorly for him. And it's the same sort of attitude. The idea is sometimes there's lessons that we are supposed to learn, and we don't learn them the easy way. And it's entirely possible that God might be teaching us the hard way. I don't like that, if I'm being honest. On the other hand, God probably doesn't love it that I'm so bad at learning. So maybe we're all on the same page of not liking this situation. But that is part of the story. But I think that we would be, I think that that's too simple of an answer, if I'm being really honest. Like, it's in the story, it's there. I'm not saying it's not part of it. But I think sometimes what happens a lot of times is we look in the world, because we believe that, like, God might teach us. Like, I don't think anybody in this room just learned anything. I think, like, oh, okay, yeah, sometimes we learn lessons. And I think sometimes so then anytime things go badly, we think, where's the lesson in this? Okay. Back up in the Bible. And let's talk about what storms are. This is an old story, maybe the oldest story in the Bible. It's about a guy named Job. It doesn't really, like, we think that it's literally older than Israel. Like, it's this really, really old story. And it's a story about a guy who loses everything, and he doesn't understand that he's part of, like, a game show between God and Satan. He has no idea, and so he just calls out God. He's like, dude, we got to talk. You have to tell me what's going on. And finally, like 37 chapters into this book, God is like, I will talk. And God's answer is somewhat infuriating, but also somewhat really cool, because God doesn't tell him anything specifically about his life. He just tells Job, you have no idea what you're talking about, which is true. He has no idea about the game show, right? So part of him saying you have no idea what you're talking about is God lays out and explains all these wonderful, beautiful things that he has done. All these incredible, just these things that God makes and does that give him glory, that are absolutely incredible. And this is what we read. We're going to read it. We're going to jump between Job 37 and Job 38. This is God in this very ancient story speaking to Job. And then we read this. God says, pay attention to this, Job. Stop and consider the wonderful miracles of God. Do you know how God controls the storm and causes the lightning to flash from his clouds? Do you understand how he moves the clouds with wonderful perfection and skill? Can you shout to the clouds and make it rain? Can you make lightning appear and cause it to strike as you direct? If you read Job, I think it's like 36 to 40. If you read Job, those 4 chapters, like 95% of it is really good. Like, it is the kind of children's church stuff. Like, God makes the rainbow. It's pretty. Like, it's great. But there's a couple of things here. This isn't the only one, but since it's a series called The Storm, let's talk about the storm. God tells Job that storms are wonderful miracles. And because I'm me, I read this, and the first thing I think is, tell that to the people of Oklahoma when they get a tornado. A wonderful miracle. Like, tell that to people with flash floods all over the place. You mean a wonderful miracle? I read one time that there's this dude who got struck by lightning like 3 times in his life. Literally, it's the crazy. Like, that dude is the opposite of the dude who should play the lottery. Like, the unluckiest guy that's ever, like, people studied him because they're like, what's wrong with you? And what they discovered was nothing. He has the worst luck in the world. Try telling that dude that storms and lightning are wonderful miracles of God. I've given a lot of grief to preachers that are not me because it's easy. That sounded arrogant. I can give myself grief too. I've given a lot of grief to some preachers. Let me do some more. When we talk about things like this, what I'm about to say, we often give an explanation for it. One of the basic theological questions is like, why does evil happen? Why do bad things happen? You know, sometimes when we're real arrogant, we'll say, why do bad things happen to good people? Because we're always assuming we're good people in that situation, which is a big assumption. But we always ask these questions, and like entire Christian theological perspectives have been built around trying to explain those questions. And as humbly as I can say it, they're all terrible. I don't know. And that's the answer. Here's what I know. I don't know why. But what I know is that God looks at things that we say are terrible or are dangerous or can harm us or can kill us. And God looks at those things and says, that's one of my miracles that shows my glory. Which means God's perspective on bad things is entirely different than our perspective on bad things. And I'm not going to say anything else than that sentence. Because any attempt to explain it for at least 2,000 years in the church, you end up believing some really wonky stuff. I don't know why, but what I know, God's just different. And because of that, there are times where there is no lesson. There's just a storm. Sometimes a storm is just a storm. A bad thing is just a bad thing. We sit around and we say, well, why are bad things happening? And the answer is we have no idea other than we know they're happening. And so that puts us into this place. The world is comprised of 2 people, 2 kinds of people. You are one of 2 kinds of people. I am one of 2 kinds of people. Every human being that has ever lived is one of 2 kinds of people. Either we live in a state where we are very often in pain. Option A. It could be a physical pain, it could be a mental pain, it could be an existential pain, it could be a spiritual pain, it could be, I don't know. You live in pain very often. Maybe daily, maybe not daily, but either way, option A is that you live in pain continually. Option B, our second kind of person, is circumstances could happen in your life that could make you option A. That's it. Either you live in pain or you could live in pain. Because the thing that the first people have is a thing you could have. I listened to this thing this week where this woman's like 49 years old. She has the dream life for almost 5 decades. Her husband gets in an accident and it destroys everything. She was the second person who became the first person. That is all of us. Any of us can get a diagnosis. Any of us can lose somebody. Any of us can get in an accident. Any of us can suffer all the time. And right now you're thinking, that's a bleak sermon, Drew. Good job. You should go back and write a new one. But see, this is the important thing we have to understand. God sees this differently. And we learn a lesson from Job and a lesson from the disciples and a lesson from the rich man and Lazarus story. I don't know why God looks at it differently, but I know that it is very good news that God looks at it differently. Because at the end of the day, because God looks at it differently, life is not black and white. It is not this binary where if things are going badly, we're like, well, what did I do wrong? Chances are nothing. And in the same way, we should always be humble to say, everything's going great. What did I do right? Chances are nothing. Let's call it what it is. But because of that, our faith in God is not dictated by what we do well. And our faith in God is not dictated in what we do poorly. And our faith in God is not dictated by how well our life is going. And our faith in God is not dictated by how poorly our life is going. The fact of the matter is we are called to trust a God who loves us unconditionally. And if we only trust God when life is going well, I dare say we are not actually trusting God. We are trusting in our circumstances that are good. I remember when I became a Christian. I remember when I was 12, and it was awesome. It was amazing. I can't describe to you how happy that made me. And I remember so many other times in my life, like these beautiful, faithful moments where it's like, man, everything is awesome. This is incredible. God has blessed me. And I don't really like that language because I think it's lame, but it's also true. It's really hard for me to look back at the moments where I felt the exact opposite of that. And to realize God loved me unconditionally then too. God was there for me then also. Maybe God put me in those situations like Jesus puts the disciples. We have to understand that God's love for us is not determined by how well our lives are going. Our hope, our ultimate hope of eternal life and resurrection and eternal love has nothing to do with how well your Tuesday afternoon or your Thursday evening goes. Because at the end of the day, our hope is in a God who loves us. A God who says, look, the storm's nothing to me. There's another perspective on this. To realize that to us, this horrible thing literally means nothing to God. That's incredible. The God we serve doesn't flinch at our pain and suffering because he loves us through it and he's with us through it. And yes, that leaves us with 10,000 questions. And yeah, every person in this room, in your heart of hearts, I bet I know a thing you think, because I think it too. Because I think if I were God, it's a great start to a sentence. If I were God, I would make a bunch of people and they would never have to hurt and it would be great. Like, why not do that? And all I can say is, well, I'm not God. And there's an answer to that he decided not to tell us. Or maybe he did tell us and we didn't listen. I don't know. But either way, here's where we sit. With a God whose love and blessings are completely separate from how good our life is going in this moment. And that's a God we can trust because that's a God who loves us through absolutely everything. This is going to come forward. We're going to sing a song. Our second week of this series has a lesson. The storm. We got 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks of talking about the same story. I hope you don't hate it yet. If you already hate this story, I'll see you May 1st. Because I'm not stopping talking about this. So, we got 2 more things from this story, but our second lesson from the storm is this. Life always includes difficulty and pain as well as peace and love. And God is with us through it all. Life always includes difficulty and pain as well as peace and love. And God is with us through us all. You guys know the invitation part of this. Look, you should get baptized. And if you haven't gotten baptized, let's talk. And if you're looking for a perfect church, it's not this one. We're done. Let's sing a song.